wind off the ridge, dust on the road, 6 days to the auction that would take the rocking V, unless Tessa Vaughn married first. Neither one expected the drifter at her gate to become the answer. Stay with me a while, because this is a story about a woman who built her life out of caliche dirt and cold mornings and refused to let a man on paper take it from her, and about a drifter who swore to everyone, including himself, that he did not stay anywhere. To understand what happened between that gate and the county courthouse, you need to know both of their fires, hers and his, before you understand what they built together. Stay for both. Annie Oakley put it best once, in words plainer than any lawyer's. I ain't afraid to love a man, and I ain't afraid to shoot him either, if it comes to that. Tessa Vaughn never fired a shot in this story. She never needed to. What she needed, she carried in her own 2 hands, and that is where we begin. The rocking V sat where the Sweetgrass basin opened wide beneath a long shoulder of gray-gold stone, the Montana wind combing low grass flat against the earth every single afternoon of the year. The ranch house squared off against it, with its back to the ridge and its face to the valley, as if the whole place had learned, the way its owner had, that you meet weather head-on or you do not meet it at all. Tessa Vaughn had run that outfit alone for 2 years, since her father's lungs gave out on him hard enough that a doctor in Helena warned him plainly he would not see another Montana winter if he tried to ride through one. And Tessa had put him on a train south to a drier climate with her own signature on the deed transfer papers and her own 2 hands taking up everything he set down. She was 26 that autumn of 1890, with dark hair pinned close against a wind that never quite let it stay pinned, and a way of standing on a piece of ground that made plain she had earned the right to stand there. She could rope a calf from a dead run and gentle a green colt without breaking a thing in it that mattered, and she kept the ranch ledger in a hand so neat you would have thought a banker kept it, though no banker alive worked as hard as Tessa Vaughn did between 4 in the morning and full dark. She kept 7 horses by name and disposition, knew which cow in the north herd favored the willow shade and which one wandered, and could read a coming storm off the color at the edge of the ridge before the wind ever reached the porch. Her hands were rope-scarred and sure, and when a green colt came into the corral, snorting and wild-eyed, she was the one who stood in the dust with it until it settled, because that was a job she trusted to no hired hand, least of all a stranger's. What she could not rope or gentle or write her way out of was the note. 8 years back, in a lean season, her father had borrowed $2,000 against the rocking V from a rancher 2 valleys over named Harlan Beck, a man who had spent the years since quietly buying up half the basin, one desperate neighbor's note at a time, until his own spread bordered better than a dozen smaller outfits he had swallowed clean. The note carried an old clause, written back when territorial law drew a hard line between a woman holding property and a man holding it, and Beck's lawyer had found that clause the way a man finds a crack in a dam, not by accident, but because he had been looking for one a long while. A single woman, the clause argued, could not hold the rocking V's deed as sole owner against a note like this one. A married woman's deed, held jointly under those same old agreements, could. Beck meant to bring that argument before the circuit judge in 6 days' time, at the county courthouse in Sweetgrass Crossing, and if he won it, the rocking V went up for auction on the courthouse steps before the first snow. 2 valleys east of the rocking V, in country a good deal harder and higher, a different kind of drifting had been wearing a man down for 6 years, and it wore the name Wade Nolan. Wade was 31, and he had worked 11 different outfits since he was 25, moving on when the season ended or the work dried up, or the place stopped feeling like something worth putting his back into, though if he was honest with himself, which he tried not to be too often, it was never really the place. It was him. He had grown up on his father's spread in the Judith country, good land his father had built with his own hands and lost anyway, in one bad winter followed by one worse banker, and Wade had ridden out of that loss at 19, telling himself that land was only land, that a man who did not put his whole heart into a piece of ground could not have that ground break his heart when it went. He had gotten good at not putting his heart into things. He was good at cattle, good at horses, good at reading a fence line and fixing a windmill pump with his hands gone numb from cold, and he was, by his own quiet reckoning, not especially good at anything that came after the work was finished, at staying in one kitchen long enough to learn which floorboard creaked, at caring which direction the wind came in through a particular window. He carried a bedroll, a saddle worn soft with use, and a good deal less than that in the way of belongings a man could point to and call his own for keeps. He had learned, over 11 outfits, exactly how much of himself to hand over to a place before it started asking for more than he meant to give. Enough to do honest work and be trusted for it, never enough that leaving cost him anything worth losing sleep over. It had served him well enough, that arithmetic. He rode up the south road toward the rocking V on a rangy bay gelding on a gold October afternoon, looking for exactly what he always looked for, a month or 2 of honest work before the snow closed the passes. Nothing more promised, and nothing more expected. He took the gate over the way he took every gate, in a slow inventory that judged nothing and missed nothing, good wire strung recent, a barn kept with real care, 3 corrals sized for 3 different purposes, and a house that needed paint on its south wall. The kind of need that showed a woman had been carrying more than any one person should carry alone. He was reaching for the latch when a voice came down off the porch. "I don't need any hands." He hadn't gotten a word out yet about wanting one. The flat, unbothered voice of someone who had already turned away 2 or 3 men that same week and expected him to make a third. He gave his account plain: cattle and horses and fence and water systems on 11 spreads across 3 territories. A green horse he could break without breaking its spirit. She came down 2 porch steps to study him properly. A woman near his own age with moss-colored eyes that took in more than they gave back, and a way of standing that made plain this was her ground, not borrowed, not managed for somebody else. What came next was not what he expected. "I don't need a hand at all. I need a husband for 6 days on paper, and I'll pay fair wages and your freedom the moment it's done." They settled the terms of it at her kitchen table over coffee gone lukewarm, Tessa laying the whole situation out without apology or ornament, the note, the clause, Beck's lawyer, the hearing 6 days off, the auction that would follow if she lost it. "I'm not asking for anything but your name on paper and your patience through one hearing. 3 months' ranch wages and you ride out Saturday a free man, no record worth finding, no claim either of us can make on the other after. Wade turned his hat over once in his hands and looked at the ledger she'd already opened on the table between them, at the neat rows of figures in a hand steadier than his own. Why me? That was the one question that mattered to him. You wrote in and made it plain straight off you don't stay. That's in your favor. It means you'll leave exactly when you promised. And I need a man who does precisely what he promises. Nothing more. Wade almost smiled at that, though it took him a moment to understand why a woman calling him unreliable felt, somehow, like being trusted. One condition. I work the ranch while I'm here. Real work, not standing around playing a part. Something eased in Tessa's face at that. Not quite a smile, more like a held breath let go. And she put her hand across the table, and he shook it. And from the doorway, an old man with a water bucket in one weathered fist stood watching the two of them a long moment before he went out to the pump without a single word. The old man's name was Gus, and he had worked the rocking V 31 years, since before Tessa was born, through a devotion that had nothing left in it to prove and everything in it to protect. He kept quiet that first evening, mentioning only that the water trough needed checking and the north fence line had gone soft where the frost heaved the posts. But Wade noticed the stall Gus had already prepared for his bay gelding, hay fresh, water clean, and he understood, the way a person understands a thing that never needs spelling out, that this ranch had been kept with real love a long while, by people who had decided a thing was worth their honest attention. The 6 days that followed were not soft ones. Tessa was up before 4 every morning, and Wade found himself rising earlier still, so the barn work was mostly finished by the time she came out, and she would stand there a moment in the gray light, looking at what he'd already done, before observing only that he hadn't needed to start so early. Work was there, was all he'd answer, and it became a small ritual between them, unspoken on both sides, that neither of them examined too closely. They rode the fence lines together, Tessa showing him where the wire needed restringing and where the ground went treacherous in a wet spring, reading the land off the back of her sorrel mare, the way some people read a book they had loved a long time. She taught him the ranch the way a person teaches something they intend to be believed about, every water source, every horse's disposition. The year Gus built the second barn, the place along Sweetgrass Creek, where you could keep a milk jar cold clean through July. Wade had a good memory for land, sharper than he liked, and he found himself using it now without the old ache that usually came with it, filing away the rocking vie, the way a man files away a thing he might someday need to defend. They talked when there was something worth saying and let the silence hold the rest, which was its own kind of honesty neither of them had found easily with anyone else. A neighbor woman named Nell Ashby, who ran cattle 3 miles east and had known Tessa the whole of her life, rode over on the second evening with a jar of plum preserves and a look in her eye that missed nothing, and by the time she left she had informed the whole basin, cheerfully and unprompted, that Tessa Vaughn had herself a husband at last, which was precisely the rumor they needed loose in Sweetgrass Crossing before Beck's lawyer came asking questions. Gus took to leaving 2 coffee cups on the porch rail some mornings before either of them came looking, and pretended, when caught at it, to have simply miscounted. On the second full day they worked cattle through the south gate, Wade holding the yearlings steady while Tessa sorted from the saddle in clean, patient arcs, her sorrel mare reading her weight before she'd finished asking. The two of them exchanged almost no words for 3 straight hours because the work needed attention, not conversation, and they both had plenty of the first to spare. When the last steer went through and the latch dropped, Wade noticed Tessa's left glove had split clean along the seam from the day's rope work, and mentioned nothing about it that evening, only that by breakfast the following morning the glove sat mended on the porch rail, stitched tight, and even with a leatherworker's care he'd never once mentioned having. Tessa turned it over in her hands a long moment before she put it on without a word of thanks, because they both understood a thing didn't need thanking to be seen. She left a jar of plum preserves from Nell's gift outside the line shack door that same night, which was its own kind of answer, and neither of them named it that. By the 4th morning they had stopped needing to plan the day's work out loud at all. Tessa would start toward the windmill, and Wade would already be walking the same direction with the wrench in hand, and she caught herself, more than once, watching the easy competence in how he moved through a job before she remembered to look away. Over cold coffee at the kitchen table one morning, she wondered aloud which of his 11 outfits had been the best. "A spread north of Billings," came his reply. "Good land, fair crew, horses worth the trouble. Did you want to stay there?" Didn't consider it much, which was not entirely true, and they both knew it, and she did not push further, because some doors a person opens on their own time, or not at all. It was the closest either of them came, in those middle days, to naming the thing neither one of them was ready yet to name. That same morning, before the light was fully up, Tessa found Wade already at the windmill with the pump housing open and grease to his elbows, and she stood a moment at the base of the tower watching him work through a stuck valve she'd been meaning to fix herself for a week. He didn't look up until it was done, the wheel spinning free again, water knocking clean and steady into the trough below. She handed him a rag without a word, and he took it the same way. And for a moment the two of them just stood there in the cold gray morning, listening to the water run, the ridge going gold at its edge, the horses stirring in the corral behind them, and neither one of them was in any particular hurry to break the quiet. On the 3rd day, Harlan Beck himself rode up the rocking V's South Road unannounced, dressed a shade too fine for a working ranch, and stood at the porch rail with his hat in hand, careful and unhurried, insisting he took no pleasure in any of this, only meant to see an old debt settled fair, the way his lawyer would put it before the judge. Tessa met him at the top of the steps and did not invite him past it. Wade came out from the barn and stood a little behind her shoulder, close enough to matter, and Beck's eyes moved between them, calculating, before he touched his hat brim, hoping aloud they'd both be at the hearing prepared. She watched his buggy go small down the South Road and let Wade know, evenly, that a patient man riding out to look you over in person was rarely a good sign, and Wade agreed, and neither of them slept easy that night. On the 4th evening, word came up from town that Harlan Beck had moved the hearing. Not Saturday, as first arranged, but Thursday, 2 days sooner, a letter delivered fast enough that someone had paid extra for the speed of it. Tessa read the note standing at her own kitchen table and set it down with a hand gone very still. "He's testing us. He wants to see if we panic and do something careless. Do you panic? Not if I can help it. They spent what daylight was left going over every question Beck's lawyer might ask in that courthouse. Every detail of the ranch a real husband would know without hesitating, until neither of them stumbled over a single answer. That same night, at the Sweetgrass Grange Hall, the whole basin gathered for its usual second Wednesday dance, and Tessa made plain to Wade that going was not optional. If Beck had a man watching, this was where a marriage got proven true in the eyes of a county faster than any courthouse could manage it. They drove in together under a sky gone hard and clear, and inside the hall, warm with lamp oil and fiddle music and the smell of coffee and sawdust, Nell Ashby pulled Tessa onto the dance floor while Wade stood along the wall answering easy questions from ranch families who assured him the rocking valley had good grass this year, and he found himself letting them know, without planning to, that Tessa knew this land better than most people knew their own names, understanding a half-second later that he had meant every word of it. Harlan Beck arrived near 9 o'clock, short and thick through the chest, dressed a shade too fine for a Grange Hall, with a lawyer named Silas Pruitt trailing him, carrying a leather case that looked entirely wrong in a room full of fiddle music. Beck crossed straight to Wade with his hand already out, a strong grip, a rehearsed smile, hoping Tessa had spoken kindly of him. She's spoken accurately. Something flickered behind Beck's eyes before the smile smoothed back over it. His gaze drifted to the dance floor, to Tessa finishing her turn, unhurried, not looking their way. She's looking very well. She always does. Wade excused himself to cross the floor and take Tessa's hand before the next reel began, close enough now that Beck could see exactly what he needed to see. Later, near the coffee table, Nell caught Wade's sleeve and studied him a moment with the frank, quick judgment of a woman who had already made up her mind about him and was simply confirming it. He's been patient about that ranch 2 years. A patient man's already decided he's going to win. He hasn't won yet, and Wade found, in the saying of it, that he believed it a good deal more than he'd expected to. The drive home was cold and clear under a sky thick with stars, and when the wagon hit a rut near the east gate and Tessa's shoulder pressed against Wade's arm, she did not pull away from it, and neither did he pull away from wanting her not to. Neither of them named it. Some things did not need a name yet to be true. Thursday came in gray and early. Tessa's lawyer, a careful, gray-eyed man named Emery Voss, arrived at the ranch at 11 with his documents in order, making plain that the deed transfer was clean, that the law itself was genuinely uncertain, and that the day would turn far more on how convincingly a marriage held together in front of a room than on any single line of ink. Beck and Pruitt came behind him, not to the ranch this time, but straight to the Sweetgrass Grange Hall, where the circuit judge held court twice a year in front of whatever portion of the county cared to watch. And by noon, the hall that had held a dance 6 nights before held instead every rancher and shopkeeper and curious neighbor for 30 miles, because in a basin that small, a fight over land was the best entertainment the season had to offer. Pruitt built his argument with care. The old clause read aloud in a flat lawyer's voice. The claim laid out plainly that Tessa Vaughn, whatever paper she now carried, could not have entered a marriage in good faith mere days before a hearing designed specifically to defeat her creditor's claim, and that the court ought to look past the ring to the timing and see the maneuver underneath it. It was to Wade's eye, watching Tessa's face stay perfectly level beside him, a fair enough thing to suspect if it were the whole truth. It was not the whole truth, and Tessa Vaughn had spent the 2 days since the hearing, moved not merely rehearsing answers, but riding hard to the county recorder's office in Sweetgrass Crossing and back, because something in Beck's compounding figures had never sat right in her father's old ledger, and a woman who kept books the way she did not let a wrongness like that sit unexamined. When Voss finished his argument on the marriage clause, Tessa Vaughn rose from her chair on her own accord and requested the judge's leave to be heard directly, and got it, because a courthouse in Sweetgrass Crossing did not often refuse a woman who stood the way she stood. She laid the recorder's certified copy of her father's original note on the table in front of the whole room. Beside the note, Beck's own lawyer had entered as evidence, and invited the room to look at the 2 figures side by side. The interest compounded on Beck's copy ran near $400 higher than the interest on the note actually filed with the county 8 years before, a difference too precise to be an honest error, and exactly large enough, she made plain, to guarantee that no honest settlement could ever satisfy it. The hall went very quiet. Harlan Beck's face did not move, which made plain to the room a great deal more than any protest could have. The judge pressed Pruitt to account for the discrepancy, and Pruitt, a careful man left entirely in the dark on it himself, had no honest answer to give, and every rancher in that hall who had ever signed a note against Harlan Beck understood, in that same silence, exactly what kind of neighbor they had been dealing with for years. The judge did not rule that day on the deed clause at all, because he no longer needed to. He referred the note itself to territorial investigation on the discrepancy Tessa had laid before him, which meant the debt underneath Beck's whole claim was frozen exactly where it stood, unenforceable until cleared, and the auction that would have taken the rocking V had nothing left to stand on. Beck rose and left the hall without another word to anyone, Pruitt gathering his papers fast behind him, and the basin watched him go the way a room watches a thing it has wanted to watch leave for a long while. Outside on the Grange Hall steps, in the cold, bright afternoon, Nell Ashby hugged Tessa hard enough to lift her half off her feet, and Gus stood a little apart with his hat in his hands, quiet, which from Gus was already a great deal. Wade stood at the edge of it, and Tessa found him there and simply looked at him a long moment, the way she looked at a piece of land she was deciding something about. That night, back at the Rocking V, they sat on the porch with 2 cups of coffee going cold between them, and Wade let her know, plainly, that Saturday had come and there was nothing left holding him there, no note, no hearing, no bargain left to keep. "I know." And Tessa did not pretend it was a small thing to say. Wade turned his cup in his hands, thinking again about what Gus had put plain once, that what this ranch needed was somebody who intended to stay. He described his father's spread in the Judith country, riding out of it at 19, telling himself land was only land, and how he had believed that well enough to get by on for 6 years, until a woman handed him a ledger and a fence line and made him care, against his own strict intentions, whether the frost heaved the north posts again come spring. I'm not asking to be paid for this. I'm asking to stay, for the rocking V and Bramble Creek and the Ridge and Gus's coffee, and you, if you'll have me. Tessa Vaughn stood up from her chair slowly, the porch light gold across her face. This was not what they had arranged. No, it isn't. Ask me properly, and he did, plainly, the way he did everything worth doing. Yes, was all she gave him back, and it was enough. From inside the barn, exactly on cue, the way it always was with Gus, came the sound of a hay fork set carefully against a wall, and a single flat observation carried clean through the October evening air. About time. Tessa laughed, a real laugh, startled out of her, and Wade crossed the porch and took her hand in both of his, and neither one of them uttered another word for a good while, because nothing else needed uttering. They married 3 weeks later, at the little church in Sweetgrass Crossing, the pews filled with ranching families who understood exactly what was being promised at the front of that room, Nell Ashby weeping without a shred of apology in the front row, Gus in a pressed Sunday coat he wore 3 times a year without fail. The ring was a plain gold band with no history to it, but the history it was about to make. Harlan Beck did not trouble the rocking V again. The territorial investigation found what Tessa already knew it would find, and Beck settled what remained of the honest debt on ordinary terms rather than risk a fraud charge in front of a judge who now knew his name. By the time the first real snow closed the high passes that winter, the rocking V ran better than it had in years, not because one person carried it alone anymore, but because 2 people had learned to carry it together. Mornings started the same as they always had. Tessa first to the barn, the ledger open on the kitchen table by lamplight, the coffee going on the stove. Except now there were 2 cups set out before either of them thought to reach for one, and a mended glove that never split again at the seam, and an old man moving about the barn at first light with the unhurried certainty of someone who had finally stopped watching the road for trouble and started simply enjoying the view. Gus stayed on, as he'd always promised he would, until he wasn't needed, and found that winter and every winter after, that he was still exactly where he meant to be. If this one found you tonight, wherever you're listening from, there's a fire always going here on the Cowgirl Chronicles, and more complete stories waiting for you beside it. First hoofbeat to last, the way this one was. Tell me in the comments what town or country you're riding in from tonight. I read every single one. If you're new here, come sit a while and stay. The gate's open, and I'll leave the light on for the next story.